Okay, hey everybody. All right, you ready? Last week, the Ukrainian parliament took a vote urging the U.S. Congress to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. So we heard their plea and we're answering their request. Today, we will be introducing a resolution urging the Secretary of State and the Biden administration to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism because they are. The Wagner Group is operating all over the world. It is seen by the Treasury Department to be a proxy of the Russian military. Putin has been engaged in war crimes on multiple fronts for 20 years. One of the most disruptive forces on the planet is Putin's Russia. And as we look at what can we do, we should be all in helping Ukraine. We should be all in making sure that Putin is marginalized and his country is marginalized as long as they engage in the behavior they're engaging in. So this designation will matter in U.S. law. There are only 4 other countries that have such a designation. They're Cuba, Syria, Iran, and North Korea. Dick and I are we're trying to include Russia to be the 5th. That's the company they should be associated with. These are totalitarian regimes that are up to no good. So I believe if we had a vote on the floor of the United States Senate urging the Secretary of State to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, it'd get 90+ votes. The hope is that we can take this resolution and put it in the Ukraine supplemental, because I think it does 2 things. It sends a strong message to the people of Ukraine: we listen to you, and we agree that the person who is destroying your country, who's murdering, raping, and killing your citizens, runs a nation that is a state sponsor of terrorism. And we're also letting the Russian people know that our fight is not with you, but is with Putin. And he has led your country down a path that's unsustainable for you. That as long as he's your leader engaging these activities, you'll be isolated on the world stage. So the audience is twofold: to the Russian people, change course, because if you stay with Putin, it's going to be a miserable existence for the Russian people. To the Ukrainian people, we're all in helping you. Now, I can't think of a stronger signal to be sent at a crucial time than the United States Congress working with the Biden administration, labeling Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. It will matter in our law. It will matter on the world stage. And Senator Blumenthal has been the most consistent, outspoken, unwavering voice on the Democratic side and in the whole Congress in making sure this moment does not pass. Putin has challenged the world. He's put in question everything we believe in. If he's still standing when this is over and he's not labeled a state sponsor of terrorism, we've missed a mark. Every law in the book regarding war crimes has been violated. Every international norm has been turned upside down. For 20 years, he's literally gotten away with murder. Now it's time to designate him in a fashion befitting his conduct. He is a terrorist, and Russia is in the hands of a terrorist state run by Putin.
Thank you. First of all, let me say how grateful I am and proud to be standing with my friend and colleague who has been such a passionate critic of totalitarianism and torture all around the world. And I've been privileged to travel with Senator Graham, to work with him on issues like this one. And he stands for freedom and democracy, not only in Ukraine, but in the Middle East, wherever it is threatened. And we've introduced this resolution. I urge you to look at the findings. These findings are a litany of terror that Putin has launched against individuals whom he's tried to poison, against countries like the Chechen capital, Grozny, or Syria, Aleppo, places where he's used chemical weapons. if there is anybody who embodies terrorism and totalitarianism and torture, it is Vladimir Putin. And Russia, unfortunately, is in his hands. And so this resolution is absolutely appropriate, and it will put Russia outside the pale of civilized nations. It puts Russia outside the family of nations that adhere to basic norms of decency and morality. And we ought to condemn Vladimir Putin's acts of terror, not only as war crimes, but also as state-sponsored terrorism within the three laws. There are three specific laws that apply here, which impose sanctions and penalties. Now, a number of these penalties are already in existence. I don't want to exaggerate what the practical effect would be. Sanctions in terms of economic penalties, export controls, those kinds of economic sanctions exist to an extent now, but I would argue that all of the banks in Russia would be encompassed by the de-swifting or deconnecting of financial institutions under this designation of Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. And equally important, individuals would have a right of action against Russia. Now, I know that may seem a little bit far-fetched, but in fact, it has been done against nations that commit terrorist acts, that kill or injure Americans, and designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism would waive its sovereign immunity. I don't mean to talk too much like a lawyer, but that's really important stuff for anybody who wants to vindicate individual rights. Designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism essentially squarely recognizes that it's in the company of Syria, Iran, Cuba, North Korea. That's the company it keeps. That's the moral sphere that it inhabits. And so I think that obviously the Secretary of State could do this on his own, and I hope that tomorrow he will. But in the meantime, this bipartisan action, I think, is more than message sending. It is a real action we can take to bolster and support the Ukrainian people. They've asked for it. We should act on it. And I really want to thank Senator Graham for his leadership. The more we can do to isolate Russia, the stronger our position. And this measure offers that prospect. And again, I just urge you to read the findings in here, because if you needed any persuasion, it's all here in black and white.
Well said. Yes, ma'am.
So we know Russia right now is acting as a foreign adversary. There's another foreign adversary, which is China. They haven't invaded another country, but they're attacking their own people. We know they're persecuting people of faith. There's evidence of them doing forced organ harvesting. Would this not be enough to also label them as a state sponsor of terror?
Well, we're focused on Russia because Russia has taken the international order and turned it upside down. The abuses you described in China, I think, are real. But if China went into Taiwan, I hope they understand what comes their way, right? So what we're trying to do is show China and other bad actors in the world, the world community is tired of this. Designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism would open up opportunities for individuals to right wrongs. It would put Russia in a unique club, and I hope China is watching. So we believe, Dick and I believe, that for 20 years we've given too much of a pass to Putin, that in a bipartisan way we have not done enough, and we're about to change that. Of all the things we could do this week, the $40 billion is really important. It puts weapons in the hands of the Ukrainian military who are fighting like tigers. It marginalizes Russia even more, and it helps the Ukrainian economy survive under this onslaught. But why did the Ukrainian parliament specifically ask for this? Because they understand the day that the United States says with a single voice that Russia is in the hands of a terrorist called Putin and the whole country is sponsoring terrorism would be a game changer in terms of the outcome of this war. So the money is incredibly important, but if we could marry up the money with the designation that Russia is a state sponsor of terrorism under our law, that would be a double blow.
And the money is really profoundly significant as a deterrent. And I think vis-a-vis China, this is another potential deterrent. The Chinese don't want to be in this club. Russia doesn't want to be in this club. But in terms of the deterrence to China taking the totally misguided action, I think they're watching. And if we act to put Russia in this club, it will be another deterrent to China.
So just quickly to be clear, this would be only a designation you could make if they were to invade. This isn't something you could put on, punish a country with for harming their own people, just to be clear.
Well, I mean, like Iran has been a bad actor all over the Mideast. Your concerns about China are legitimate, but we have in front of us the invasion of a sovereign nation by Russia, war crimes on an industrial scale. Under our law, we can't really cooperate with the International Criminal Court. We're not a member, and I'm not suggesting we join. But Dick and I are looking for ways to put pressure on Putin's Russia. I think we should be cooperating, sharing evidence we have about war crimes being committed by Russian forces inside of Ukraine. I think if the United States Congress could put into the supplemental aid package the designation of Russia being a state sponsor of terrorism, it would send the strongest signal yet that Putin as a leader of Russia is no longer considered legitimate. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to bolster the Ukrainians' ability to fight for their own freedom. We're trying to delegitimize Putin. This would be the strongest statement yet that he's not a legitimate leader in the eyes of the United States Congress and the Biden administration.
And just to answer your question very directly, it isn't necessary that there be an invasion by a state sponsor of terror. The whole idea is a state sponsor of terrorism. Russia arguably was sponsoring terrorism before they invaded because they had their surrogates, their proxies, their mercenaries in Ukraine. I visited Ukraine in a bipartisan delegation shortly before the invasion. One of my colleagues asked President Zelensky, "Are you fearful about the Russians invading your country?" And he looked at us and he said, "The Russians invaded our country in 2014. They've killed 14,000 of our people. They've been sponsoring terrorism, as these findings show, for years and years and years, and they should be held accountable in every possible way." I agree this measure ought to be part of the supplemental because we're acting not only with the economic and the military force of the United States of America, but also our moral force.
Two questions, if I may. To what extent, if any, would this influence any approach to a diplomatic solution? Is that still on the table? How would this impact reaching a diplomatic solution to ending the war? And then second part, unrelated, but on the supplemental, I wanted to ask, we're starting to see production constraints with regard to our ability to quickly produce key weapons, stingers, javelins. Are we reaching our limits? We have agreements to send Taiwan weapons over the next few years, and they've raised concerns that we may miss those deadlines. What can we do? What is done by the supplemental to ensure that we're bolstering our production capability, and are we at risk of reaching our limits
Let me answer both questions, and Senator Graham may have a different answer. First of all, whatever the diplomatic solution or the solution militarily or diplomatically, the Ukrainians have to decide what they want. I think their goal ought to be to win.
Yeah.
I think we should support their winning. I said today in the Armed Services Committee, we've been schizophrenic. We want them to win, but we don't want Putin to lose in a way that might escalate. We've got to be all in on Ukraine winning. And whatever they do diplomatically is their choice. But obviously, we've been negotiating with Iran, maybe not directly face-to-face, but the JCPOA was under negotiation. Whatever you think about the prospects for the JCPOA, there's no legal barrier to our negotiating diplomatically. On the second question, yes, we are reaching our limit. Absolutely. We ought to be using the Defense Production Act. That's the answer to your question. We need to use the Defense Production Act for a variety of different arms and weapons platforms, including the Javelin missiles. We've already sent 1/3 of our total inventory of Javelin missiles or more to Ukraine. Replenishing those stocks means ordering defense manufacturers to do more of them and not be selling Javelin missiles to countries where our own national security isn't involved. They may have contracts with those countries, but they should be focusing where our national security is involved. And the Defense Production Act is the answer.
Just to add to it, I couldn't agree more with what he said. There was a time when we were the arsenal of democracy. We need to embrace that again. That's just a fact. I just got back from Taiwan. The F-16s that they need yesterday are being made in Greenville, South Carolina. So I think you'll see Senator Blumenthal and myself, Democrats and Republicans, urging the military-industrial base of America to ramp up, which means we need to put more money in the pipeline. As to how this war ends, it really is up to Ukraine, but here's what I would say. Russia needs to change for victory for the world. As long as Russia is in the hands of Putin, he's propping Assad up, who is designated as state sponsor of terrorism. Now, it doesn't mean you can't negotiate, but it does mean you made a clear moral decision that Putin's Russia is in a very limited group of people on the planet. And what I would hope is that when the Ukrainians try to end this slaughter, that they understand that all the people who died in the Ukraine died for a purpose. They fought. They fought for their freedom, the integrity of Ukraine. So the designation is deserved, and it will stay on Putin's Russia as long as they're a state sponsor of terrorism. We can do two things at once.
And by the way, I just want to add that nations can be designated and then taken off the list. For example, Iraq, South Yemen, Libya, and Sudan were on that list and have been removed. So this is not, irrevocable.
Not that it would ever possibly happen, but does Putin belong in a jail cell, in a prison?
I think Putin deserves to be investigated for war crimes committed on his watch by his forces. I think it goes back 20 years. He's killed people that oppose him. He's jailed people that are opposition. He is supporting the biggest thugs in the world. The Wagner Group is just parading around the planet in Mali as I speak today, trying to disrupt. I think the International Criminal Court is right to look at Putin as a war criminal individually. I think it would be in our interest to aid them in that investigation. Let's look at it this way. When this is all said and done, and he's not held accountable, every law in the book becomes a joke.
And I agree totally. I would just add that whether it's the ICC or some other body, he should be investigated, held accountable, and punished to the extent it is possible to do. I'm under no illusions about that happening tomorrow, but as a matter of principle, who can see the pictures of those Ukrainians with their hands tied behind their backs, shot in the head, the stories, the graphic stories of what Russian soldiers have been doing to Ukrainians? It certainly qualifies as war crimes.
Two questions, Senators. The first, the Biden administration has been hesitant yesterday, Jen Psaki said that they're still hesitant to do that. She named other provisions that they've already taken, other steps they've taken. Have you had conversations with Democratic leadership to get this as part of the supplemental package? And I'll ask you my second question.
I'm not going to talk about my conversation with Democratic leadership, but let me just make the point that members of Congress over the last almost decade have been ahead of
Right.
the executive branch on this
parties.
issue under several administrations. I worked with Senator McCain on amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act, and when Senator Graham was on the committee, he worked with us to provide lethal arms to Ukraine as far back as 2000, I think it was 2015, 2016. So there is a trend here of Congress being a little bit ahead of the administration, maybe putting some pressure on the administration, all to the good, not necessarily being critical, but still being ahead. And I think perhaps that's what's happening here. And I hope there will be a vote on it. But even if there isn't, and the Secretary of State were to say tomorrow, you know what, I've thought about it, and we ought to designate them as a state sponsor of terrorism, that's the result that we're seeking.
Yeah, let me just, Senator Schumer included our war crimes resolution urging the United States to help the ICC within the confines of our law to support the investigation. Senator Blumenthal was leading. It's true of Republican and Democratic administrations that when it comes to arming the Ukraine, it's been a difficult process. The Congress has been pushing. Here's what I believe. I believe the designation is warranted, that there is no salvaging. You know, the President Macron may have said something today that, or yesterday, that if it's true, is disturbing, and I like him a lot. We can't humiliate Putin when we end this war. Bull. It's not about humiliating Putin. It's about calling him out for the war criminal he is. That way of thinking needs to end. If you're embarrassed by saying that Putin needs to go, then there's something wrong with you. He needs to go. That's up to the Russian people. We're not going to invade Russia. We're not going to put ground troops in Ukraine, but we're going to support Ukrainian victory, and victory is expelling the Russians, trying to end this slaughter. But what I think is that the designation is warranted, and 90 senators at least would vote for this. So to the administration, I understand your concerns and your reluctance, but what we're trying to do is demonstrate to you that the American people will be behind you if you go down this road.
In addition to the request you both are making, there are other provisions like the Afghan Advancement Act, refugee provisions, the oligarch sanctions. Do you worry that adding those things to the supplemental package might muddy the waters and make it harder for people to vote for it?
Okay, the Afghan Readjustment Act, there's some problems. We're working with Senator Coons and others. Just give us some time. I think that's probably more than the market will bear. But in terms of this, the Ukrainian Rada, is that what you call it, the parliament, asked us a week ago to designate Russia as state-sponsored terrorism because they believed it would help turn the tide of the war. This is one tool in the toolbox. You're going to see me vote for a $40 billion package if it's reasonably structured. Because if this is not an emergency, Putin losing to me is priceless. It's priceless. Whatever the cost we need to bear, let's get this right, because if we don't, China will surely invade Taiwan. So I just really think that this designation would enhance the package. And that's what I would say to Senator Schumer. That's what I would say to Senator McConnell, what I'd say to Secretary Blinken.
And it's directly related to the package. The Afghan, and I'm a supporter, and I'm hoping that it will pass. I've been an advocate of enabling more Afghan at-risk allies to escape the Taliban. They have targets on their backs. Their situation is dire and dangerous. We owe them safe passage out of Afghanistan, but that's a measure that has to be considered separately.
Thank you. This resolution mentions Georgia as one of the targets of Russian Federation.
Yeah.
When, and I would like to follow up on that, when the administration officials testified in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, senators asked about other vulnerable countries in Russia's neighborhood, Moldova and Georgia. They had concern that Russia can continue its aggression against these countries. I wonder if you share this concern and what the Congress and administration are doing to help these countries to defend themselves in case Russia continues its aggression against them.
Well, I do share the concern that he will go further than Ukraine. There's two provinces in Georgia that are occupied, talking about opening another front in Moldova, right? So the theory that Ukraine is run by Nazis is a joke, is offensive to the Ukrainians fighting for their freedom. But this idea that NATO is the cause of this aggression, the Pope is a good holy man, but when the Pope suggests that NATO was partially responsible for Putin's action, that is just absolutely unequivocally wrong. Putin announced last June his plans. His plans are to rewrite the European map, right? To recreate the Soviet Empire, the former Soviet Union, as much as he can. And Dick and I believe with all our heart and soul, if we don't stop him in Ukraine, he's going further. And that's why the designation is so important, because for 20 years he's been doing things that would justify this designation, violating the sovereignty of countries, but his plan is far beyond the Ukraine. So to me, designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism will add teeth to the package. And yes, I worry about Georgia. Yes, I worry about Moldova. But there'll come a time when the Russian generals are going to have to pick. You're going to have to pick following the orders of this madman or the future of your own country. People worry about nuclear exchanges. Nobody wins a nuclear war. I think most everybody in the Russian military infrastructure understands that. But there'll come a time when the Russian military operation, special operation in Ukraine will be seen by Russians as the end of Russia being an acceptable member of the international community. The sooner we can get that message to the Russian military and the Russian people, the better.
And to answer your question very directly, by now we should have learned.
Yes, amen.
Putin is a thug and a bully. He will continue, in fact, become an increasing threat to Europe and the world unless he is stopped. That's why our own national security is at risk. Designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism will embolden other European countries and the world to treat him as a bully and a thug and to avoid dealing with him.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.